We steal the waves in the air and we never give them back. We are.
We are.
We are.
We are. We are.
We are.
Lofi Poli Sci. Oh, yes, we are. Lofi Poli Sci podcast coming at you. I'm your host, Michael Pickering, and I hope you're already out there for another Tuesday's Top 10 list. And today, we're welcoming back to the show our good friend, Gregory Day, writer, director, bookseller, and the voice behind Hipsville AD, the blog that is the one-man fanatical sect of God subculture with fervent ramblings of all breeds of cinematic pleasures. Gregory Day, my friend, how have you been?
I've been great, man. How are you?
I'm doing excellent. I'm going to ask what's new with you lately coming up, but you ready to jump into this list?
Yeah, man, I am ready to jump in this list. Let's get going.
Excellent. Well, then, why don't you start by telling our listeners what top 10 film list do you have for us this month?
Yeah, this month I have a top 10 political cinema list. So it's going to be my personal choice of picks. So I'm going to call it a introduction to political cinema from my point of view.
Ooh, I like it already. Oh, Lo-Fi Poli Sci like. We'll talk about that more coming after the list. But let's go ahead and jump into it. Coming in at number 10 is
Yeah, these first two picks are going to be classics of political thrillers, which is a big chunk of what political cinema really is, at least in this country. So number 10 is All the President's Men from 1976, based on the Paramount political investigation by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, and how they cracked the Watergate scandal in the mid 70s. And ultimately brought down Nixon from his presidency. The movie itself is a really great thriller, but it's also a great snapshot of journalism, and it's really fascinating to me watching how journalism actually works, not sensationalism, but how you have to cooperate stories and get multiple points of view on things in order to get to the truth of stories, and especially when you're going after the president. So to quote The Wire, if you're going to go after the king, you better not miss. So, and these guys definitely brought all their skills to this story, and it's a huge part of American history.
Absolutely. I mean, I'll go ahead and say I've never seen this movie, but I'm hyper aware of this movie. You know, Hoffman and Redford in their prime, the Watergate scandal. And for me, as the poli sci person, normally I tell people that this is one of the big movements in times where we see investigative journalism take off like never existed before in human history, especially in this country. But let me ask you, so like, 1976 this film came out. Do you feel it's a little bit dated, or do you still feel it's spot on with its representation of what happened?
I've read the book too, and I feel like the movie is a great adaptation of the book. And although it's a simplification of the book, because if you read the book, if you're not really into everybody who was involved at the time, and you can get a little lost. But I feel like the movie itself, it plays really well today. Like even though it's simplified and you're kind of following, just you got to follow the narrative of the movie instead of following the sprawling investigation. It still holds up, man. And you're like, especially with today's political scandals, trying to find people who are speaking out against things in administration stuff. It really holds up well, like in that aspect, uh, to our modern sensibilities.
Mm, I might have to have a movie day for a few classes of mine. Just
Yeah.
maybe, just maybe. All right, let's keep going. Moving on to number 9. What do you have for us?
Yeah, our second thriller here, and this sort of what could be a thriller double feature, is a movie called Z, just the letter Z from 1969. It's a French film that is inspired by the assassination of a Greek left-wing politician in the 60s, which is sort of another tragic political assassination or downturn political event in the 60s. Kind of helped maintain the right wing, almost fascist government of Greece at the time. But this film was made in France, and it's made by the legendary film director Costa Gavras, who made a lot of political films in his career, but this one is just like a really intense political thriller about this politician who is killed, and then everything that happens after it. So it's also explores like everyone in his cabinet scrambling to figure out what's going on. It's a thriller about all these fascist thugs who've been hired by the right wing to kill not only the politician but like bully or possibly kill everyone else in the cabinet, whoever's trying to uncover these things. And if you watch this film, it's just like there's so many great staged like riots and action scenes. It's hard to believe like you're watching a work of fiction. But it's an amazing, incredible film, and I think this is one of the political thrillers that kind of flies under the radar, especially here in America. But it's just a great picture.
And this one's fascinating for me specifically because in my undergraduate years, I really focused in on Francophone politics. And 1969 in France was huge for student protests all over the country, fascist military regime in Greece. There was a whole lot going on in Europe still in the late 1960s. And seeing it represented on film like this, I found very interesting. And it really, it called me back to learning about all of that kind of stuff. I liked it a lot.
Yeah, this movie, yeah, is spot on and like coming out right in the heat in the moment. Because like that specific year, the entire world was in political upheaval, and watching this flick, it's like you could see just what it was like, just how intense it was, and it's just like a shift in culture and how dangerous a lot of these situations were.
Most certainly. I'd say, like how you put the first two together, Z and All the President's Men, 1969, 1976, the world very much was changing and was finding its own identity at that time. But I do like your pick for number eight. Go ahead and tell us what number eight is.
Yeah, number eight. I got to get in some genre movies here. So there are a couple on the list here. But the first one I'm going to talk about is from 2016 called Shin Godzilla. It's the last Japanese Godzilla movie that was released. And this Godzilla movie definitely harkens back to the original Godzilla. If you're familiar with the original Godzilla, it's a allegory for the atomic bomb being dropped in Japan. Godzilla represents that. So in this one, Godzilla really represents climate change, and from a Japanese point of view, more so like a tsunami than we would maybe want to identify with a hurricane here in America. Um, but what the film really gets at is the political infighting between different state departments about how they're going to resolve stopping this force of nature destroying property and land and killing people and all these things. It's like all these people fighting each other and getting fired over making the wrong decisions, and really how things break down because no one can make a decision, and Godzilla wreaks havoc, as he tends to do. But it's also a really fun movie. But that's I don't want to spoil the ending, but yeah, it definitely is, it shows how climate change is forever changing the landscape on our planet, and it does really well exploring that through a giant lizard.
Yeah, I will say I have seen this one. Although whenever I've watched it, I had no idea it was going to have all the political intrigue that it did. And it amazed me how much it got into the nitty-gritty of Japanese politics about how to deal with Godzilla.
Mhm.
And I really like how you portray it. And I think you're right. And at first watching it, I never thought about it as like, Japan's view about climate change, and Godzilla was climate change. But I mean, what a great, like you said, an allegory or a metaphor of demonstrating what its destructive force really is. I like it. I like it a lot.
Yeah, this is a good one. I would highly recommend folks watch this one.
All right, now let's go on to number seven. What do we have?
Yeah, number seven, we're really shifting gears here. From 1975, a movie called The Lost Honor of Katharina Blum. This is a classic of the new German cinema of the time. And if you're not familiar with what that is, there was a new wave of German filmmakers in the 70s who were trying to find the German identity in cinema. Post-war, it's a few generations later, but they still did not have what they felt was an identity of their own after the Nazi Party had crumbled and the American occupation and all these things going on. There's extreme political upheaval going on because we have it's still divided, right? So it's still West and East Germany. There's all this terrorism happening, and we have this overreach of the police state. So the film is based around this central character, Katharina Blum, who goes out to a party one night and meets a guy. She goes home with him, has, one night stand, it's casual relationship. And the next day she finds out that he was a terrorist, and the state is up her ass after that. She is, imprisoned and interrogated, relentlessly interrogated. And it becomes a big scandal in the newspapers, and her life is basically torn apart because of this political system in West Germany. So it really explores how not only the government is pressing this woman, but also how the press and the media is exploiting her as well. And it does kind of shift into like, is the state, um, implicated in creating these terrorists, in creating these people who are uh, forced to be forced to make desperate acts, because Katerina's life is definitely it definitely begins to spiral out of control as she's forced into this situation. But just one side note, it's directed by Margarita von Trotta, who is an amazing filmmaker from Germany. She's done some other great political films of this time period, especially the one that I want to give a shout out to called Mariana and Julianne, which is set in the same time period, but it's about two sisters who are divided by political ideology. So that stuff is very fascinating to me, how politics affect the personal stuff. So I would also recommend checking that one out.
I couldn't agree more. And to kind of put both of the films together and the ideas behind it. So how and first one about Katharina Blum, how government and terrorism and ideology and third persons, because Katharina Blum is a third person. She's not related to the ideology of what the terrorist is and what the government is and what should be. She's just a bystander who gets mixed up into it. But then the second movie you just talked about two sisters who are of different political ideologies and the conflict that is between individuals. I think we can all say we know what that is like in today's political climate, not just here, but in everywhere around the world. And people are trying to figure out, can you be close to someone who thinks differently than you? And this is not a new question by any stretch of the
Mhm.
imagination. So I think it's great, that you bring up
Yeah.
in a new wave German cinema that they were dealing with this question.
Yeah, yeah. It's a very I would recommend if anyone's interested in watching these kinds of films, especially from the 70s in Germany, to check them out. They're really politically focused and but really on their identity. So those two things going hand in hand, because their history with different kinds of governments in that country makes some very complicated storytelling.
All right, excellent stuff right there. Now, going on to number 6, what do you have for us?
Yeah, I got The Other Side of Hope from 2017. It's from a filmmaker that's very dear to me, whose name is Aki Kaurismäki out of Finland. Most of his pictures are these deadpan humor stories about people who are kind of on the outskirts of Finnish culture and modern society, and sort of the absurdities of culture clashes in Finnish society. But what this particular movie deals with is the Syrian refugee crisis, and these refugees coming to Finland, and sort of the absurdities of the culture clashes between the Syrians and the Finns, and sort of getting to the heart at what creates nationalism, and what how people can adapt to situations, and how people can either be sympathetic or unsympathetic to people's plights in life. And it's a really funny movie, but it also shows some really dark realities of what it's like for someone to have to leave a country only to come to another country, and not to be welcome.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think this movie is important for a few different reasons. Well, one, because since the Syrian refugee crisis started taking place, since the Syrian war started in 2011, we have seen a huge rise in xenophobia in Europe and really all across Western democratic countries, developed countries in particular, where a lot of migrants are moving to. And Finland, people who know me in academia, they always know whenever I bring up Freedom House organization that rates countries by civil liberties and civil rights from 0 to 100, Finland is one of those countries that gets a perfect 100, that it looks like it's a perfect democracy. It's free, it's happy, and Finland is almost always on the top of any list as far as quality of life goes. Even in Finland,
uh
xenophobia
Yeah.
exists.
I don't have a lot of experience with or a knowledge of what's going on in Finland like you do, but from my experience watching Kirsmaki's films, it seems to be a completely different story.
Right, right, and that's what watching the trailer for this one, there were some points where I just was really laughing out loud. I was like, "I can't believe this." I was like, "This is Finland," and I don't wanna go too much into it. I want people to
Yeah.
experience this because
Mhm.
Finland is portrayed as the perfect place, and this kind of puts a quirky spin on it. And especially for any of you lo-fi listeners out there who are familiar with the Syrian refugee crisis, the larger refugee crisis of the Arab Spring, this all ties into it. So I think this is a great pick. I loved it. I loved it. All right, where are we going for number five?
Number five, we're coming into American film from last year. I don't really talk about a lot of new movies, as I stated, I think on the last episode, but this one really got me. It's called Never, Rarely, Sometimes, Always. It's from a great American filmmaker here named Eliza Hittman. She's a very exciting new voice in American movies. She does these great socially aware movies. Her last movie was called Beach Rats, which was about toxic masculinity and homosexuality in the Jersey Shore culture. That's sort of like hyper macho culture, and they have like a sort of documentary quality to her work. But this one, which is very similar in style, is about a young girl in Pennsylvania who is pregnant. She's 17 and she has to travel out of state to get an abortion. She has to travel to New York City, which is a very scary place for someone from rural Pennsylvania. And it's very poignant because in my home state of Texas here, we have some very restrict reproductive right laws that just passed. And this movie is I think everyone should see it who's interested in this or who has certain points of view on reproductive rights and what it's like for women to have to go through these sort of things. She has to travel, and use all of her money to get to where she needs to go to make this life changing decision. Otherwise, her life is going to be forever changed by this pregnancy. And it doesn't skirt on the details. It shows exactly what it's like to have to go to a Planned Parenthood and how the steps you have to go through and the funds you have to do and all the paperwork you have to do. So it's not an easy thing to do, as the movie shows. And I don't think it's much more a complicated issue than I think a lot of people who pass reproductive right laws understand.
No, I think you're right, and I'm glad that you brought in the idea of Texas and the new law going into effect. And whenever I was getting into this film, I was like, it automatically made me think of Texas. But really, it's not just Texas; it's a larger countrywide issue that's been going on for several years now. And I
Hmm.
think you're right. This does a really excellent job of showing, how do we say, showing a face to these stories. So often do we think of women's rights issues or abortion issues, whether it's pro life or pro choice. We don't necessarily always put faces to what's actually going on. I think politicians in particular, they have a way of talking about this in arbitrary and big terms without trying to make it about individuals. And I think this story following this girl and her friend who goes with her, I think it's an amazing story that I agree with you. A lot of people should take the time and watch.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And I don't want to sugarcoat it. It's a very tough movie to watch, but I think it's a very rewarding movie, ultimately.
For sure. And to everyone out there, there's a lot of movies that are really, really tough to watch. And you, as an individual, need to consider if you are the type of person who can watch
Hmm.
these more intense, more realistic in many ways, in your face type of films. So, just check into movies before you go into them, because if it's something that you can't handle, then don't force yourself to watch something that you not really going to be able to take into.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
all right, but now let's go into number four. What do we have?
Yeah, man. Number four is a film called Blind Chance from 1987. It's from the renowned Polish filmmaker Krzysztof Kieślowski. He is very famous for making the Three Colors trilogy, and he died fairly early on in his career. But this movie is one of the films he made in Poland that kind of condemns Polish politics, but really is trying to get to the heart at like making choices. And Blind Chance is the story of a guy who is trying to make a change in his life. He's got to catch a train, And when he gets to the train station, the movie diverges into three different variations on what happens in his life, whether he catches the train or not. And each different variation is him taking a different political path, one to the right, one to the left, and one in the center, or one where he doesn't make a choice. And so each variation shows how his life changes, whether he's right wing and he works for the state and he becomes a very harsh and nasty individual, and one where he comes left and he gets involved in political persecution, or one where he chooses to become a family man. And it really illustrates that even if you don't choose a path, uh, that the world is still going to come for you. So it's a very interesting story because it's dealing with politics of the time and in Poland. But I think it's really fascinating because again, we're getting to that heart of politics and personal lives interacting and how politics affects the life, even if you don't make a choice.
I think that's a great way to phrase it because, even myself growing up, I knew so many people and myself too for a very long time. I was apolitical. Yes, all you people know it out there, a political scientist at once upon a time, I was apolitical. I didn't want to have anything to do with it. But this movie really shows that even making that choice is still making a choice.
Mhm.
You are still affected by things, whether you like it or not. And I think the idea that in 1987, which is just 2 years before the Berlin Wall falls and before Poland thereafter also goes towards its independence from the Soviet Union, and you get an independent Poland.
Mhm.
The idea that in 1987 that this film was being made and showing the three divergent paths, I think is really, really amazing.
Yeah, it's really politically savage. I would highly recommend this one, and but also on a filmmaking level, Kieślowski is one of the most famous filmmakers, European filmmakers of that time period. And this movie particularly shows how gifted he was as a filmmaker.
Yes, most certainly. Especially for those of you out there who are really into Cold War politics and Soviet Union politics, and you want to kind of have a little bit of an idea about what choices were like in the Soviet Union. What a great way to take a look at it. Although I will say Poland, out of all the other Soviet satellite states, Poland was probably the most free, with major finger quotes around that. Okay, Poland wasn't free. Okay, but Poland compared to a lot of the other Soviet satellite states, they had a lot more leeway.
Mm.
Just because they were closer in geographic distance to Western Europe and a lot of other reasons as well play into it. But still, I think that may have something to do with why you could actually see this film come out. And I want to ask you too, because, Polish filmmaker, 1987, did this film actually debut in Poland in 1987 while it was still a Soviet satellite country?
Yeah, it absolutely did. I don't know too much about the censorship view of this movie, but yeah, it did come out in Poland. Poland has a robust history of cinema, going all the way back to the 50s. Post-war up through now. Like they had a lot of great cinematic minds in that country. And but I can say that Kieślowski did leave Poland not too long after this movie. So I don't know if it's because of the pressure or if he was just looking for more freedom in his art. But yeah, he did not hang around Poland much longer after this.
Oh, that's very interesting to me. And maybe one of you lo-fi listeners out there can look into that for us. Art and politics. I dig it. I dig it. And I imagine he might have left because of this film coming out. Because, like I said, although Poland was freer than other Soviet states, it was still most certainly a Soviet state in 87. All right, now let's move on to number three, getting into our top three here. What do we have coming in?
Yeah, I wanted to choose one more genre movie because that's what Hipsville is all about, the genre cinema. We're talking about They Live from 1988 by the great filmmaker John Carpenter. Now, a lot of people who watch this movie may just look at it as a action movie about aliens, but what it's really about is about the wealth inequality in America and the political systems use of capitalism to make people focused on consumerism over than looking at political issues or things that are affecting their lives. So I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with this movie, but yeah, it's really if you really focus on the characters, these people are homeless. They're construction workers, but they're homeless, and they're every day they're bombarded by messaging, and it does get to a point where you start to see the world, and it's a little conspiratorial, but it really is talking about how American politics and consumers culture is diverting our attentions away from the things that really affect our lives into consumerism.
And this film really makes me think, and when you're talking about capitalism and John Carpenter's view on capitalism and consumerism being a form of escapism from some of the effects and byproducts of capitalism, it's really important to notice when this film came out in that context. It's 1988, and we are on the cusp of the Berlin Wall falling and the Soviet Union dissolving and capitalism claiming victory in the world. This is where we get the beginnings of the international economy that is predicated on capitalist free market ideas. We're right about to jump in that era. And here we are in 1988 with John Carpenter as one of the biggest filmmakers in the world. He makes this movie and he says, capitalism, people, maybe we should think twice. And I think the use of aliens is amazing because he really uses it to kind of make a us versus them thing, and where you have political and economic elites in the world, but they just as soon be aliens because they are not like the rest of us. Like would you say that's really the kind of message he's putting forward?
Oh, absolutely, yeah, yeah. If you watch his movies, you could see over time him having these anti-Reagan, anti Margaret Thatcher views in his films. And yeah, 100%. Like these aliens are not like the rest of us. The ruling class is not like the rest of us.
Exactly, exactly. A great choice. And now going to your number two, a great choice, but a difficult one. Bring us
Yeah,
into it.
yeah. This is a difficult movie. You seem like you might be familiar with it, but it's called White Dog from 1982 by one of America's great genre yet political filmmakers, Samuel Fuller. This is the film that really ended his career for multiple reasons, but what it does focus on is a struggling actress in Hollywood. She's white, and she takes in this white German Shepherd, and it's a loving animal, and it protects her. But as soon as she interacts with a black man on her property, dog goes crazy and tries to kill this or attack this man. And she soon finds out that the dog that she's taken in is uh, quote unquote a white dog, which is trained to kill black people, white supremacist trained dog. And so the film is about a black pet trainer who is trying to deprogram this dog, and it's all a metaphor for can racism be deprogrammed in America. And I won't spoil how it ends, but it's a very difficult movie dealing with a very tough subject matter. It was like, can America change? And this movie came out in 1982, and so we're still dealing with this subject today. And I think the movie still is relevant today because it is taking a hard look at these things. But Samuel Fuller was a genre filmmaker at heart, and so this movie is very tough and very visceral, and it doesn't pull its punches. It verges on being a horror film because it's very vicious about this dog. Um, but yeah, I can't recommend this movie enough because it is, it's like being punched in the gut when it's about the subject that it's tackling.
It most certainly is. And you're right. I am very familiar with this movie. And you're also right again to say 40 years later, we're still trying to tackle this issue and say, how do we get rid of racism? Can we just deprogram a person? Does it take a generation? Does it take two generations? The conversation has never been finished. And how do we get rid of it? And I think you're absolutely right that and I don't know about the filmmaker specifically and the ending of their career, but this film does not pull its punches, just like you said, and it attacks that issue and puts it right in front of you. Like you cannot hide from it in this film.
Yeah, yeah. It was before it was released. It was perceived as being racist itself about a dog attacking black people before anyone really saw it and knew what it was really about. That it was actually about trying to get to the heart of this problem and get to the heart of what is the problem with white people. And so it definitely it killed his career as being kind of falsely um, portrayed in the media. But he had a long career of, like working from the 40s through the 80s and making genre movies that were about racism and about sexism and about patriotism, all these things. And this is the one that finally got, maybe too close to the bone for some Americans.
Yeah, I hear you. And really, I think especially moving forward with some films we may be talking about, one thing about political films in general, it's one thing where you have a film that is political and it just happens to be a director who does a political film. And then sometimes there are directors who are always in your face about politics. And it's a risky thing to do, no matter which way you lean, left, right, or middle. If you decide to focus on political issues time after time after time again, especially in film, you're putting your work out there for the masses and for media to go after you. You're inviting them to go after you. So it's extremely risky medium to put your own thoughts out there. All right, and that
Yeah.
being said, let's go ahead and jump into your number one. What do you have?
Yeah. So the list began with sort of a little double feature about thrillers. This list ends with a little double feature up tackling racism. We had the genre version of that with White Dog, and now we have um, the great sort of message film, sort of influenced by Hollywood tropes and style, is Do the Right Thing from 1989. Sort of, it doesn't maybe really come to mind, but it is sort of a lavish, extravagant production about one day in Brooklyn and how many factors create racial turmoil in the lives of this neighborhood. And so I'm sure that everyone is very familiar with this film. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. No matter what you think of Spike Lee, you may have seen him in commercials or you see him courtside at games yelling at the players, the refs, or whatever. But this film undeniably is an American classic. It really shows how things spiral out of control in these neighborhoods. It's all set in one day during a heat wave. No one's got no one can escape the heat. Everyone's powers, rolling, like they're going through rolling brownout. So everyone's tempers are boiling over, and you just see how things get out of control. But the really interesting thing about the movie is it's still dealing with things that we're dealing with today, which is police brutality and community's response to that brutality, which is the climax of the movie. I won't go through it, but it really um, explores the community's response to this happening in their neighborhood very clearly and very complicated, or very complexly, I should say, and like why communities respond the way they do to the police treating them a certain way. So it's a incredibly relevant movie today. Like if you watch this movie, you can see it reflected in our American way of life today, especially last year when we went through this all over again. Yeah, it's a fantastic film. It's very funny. It's very personable, and I think it's Spike Lee's greatest achievement.
I think you're absolutely right. 30 years later, just over 30 years later, we are still tackling these same questions about how neighborhoods deal with police brutality, how communities deal with it, how cities, how states, how a country deals with it. It just goes to show that racism is not a new topic, and we have been trying to figure out what to do about it for a very long time. And we're still trying to understand the many different facets of it. And I think Spike Lee, like you said, whether people like him or not, this is a great movie to really talk about this issue. So I do think it is worth a watch
Yeah,
for
yeah,
sure. I
and
agree with you.
yeah, 100%. I think, and even like the title itself, like just, oh, excuse me, just thinking about the title, like "Do the Right Thing." What is the right thing to do? What is the right thing for the police to do? What is the right thing for a community's response to do? And ultimately, it's a question mark. Does his character do the right thing in the end? And I think a lot of people should ask themselves that question when they're making decisions that affect other people.
I couldn't say it any better than that. And I'll leave it that. Yes, yes, indeed. All right, and there you have it. That is our list. But now, as is our custom on any top 10 list, let's dig a little deeper. Gregory Day, in the past, I never really asked you, but I am curious this time. Did you have any runners up or honorable mentions that you want to just like quickly throw out there? Because I feel like 10 films is quite limiting. So do you have any runners up you want to throw out there?
Yeah, yeah. I always struggled to narrow down to 10 films because there's just a wealth of art and cinema out there. For each of the topics we talked about, there are two today that I really did want to bring up. Is one because it's incredibly relevant. Is a film called Osama from 2003, which was the first film made in Afghanistan after the Taliban fell, and it is definitely relevant now, exploring that life under the Taliban. And then I wanted to talk about a film called Boat People from the early '80s from Hong Kong. I won't get too far into it, but it's another refugee film, focusing on the end of the Vietnam War and about a political journalist photographing what it's like under a unified Vietnam. And those two films are very powerful, but I just couldn't fit them on the list.
And both is still extremely relevant. Like you said, with everything going on in Afghanistan today, I would be very interested to check out that film. And then also, as far as Hong Kong has been changing so fast, so drastically these past 2 years, where now you're starting to have Hong Kong citizens being refugees going to um, Great Britain and to other places. So great, excellent choices. I always wanted to ask, do you have runners up? So I'm glad that you do. All right, next question. For this list in particular, this is the first time I ever asked you to do, some broad area. I asked, could you do something maybe like political in nature because, Lofi Poli Sci and all. But I left it broad like that for you to go your own direction outside of, just political. But what made you go this specific direction? Like what influenced your choices? You had a whole lot of international films as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think every time I make a list, I always want to try to bring a broad spectrum to the choices from around the world, from different artists and everything. So I really made a really big list and try to narrow it down, and I wanted to represent how different countries around the world, different political ideas, and different voices, really, and trying try to get to a core of like different people's perspectives on things. And but also like my personal movie choices. So I feel like I could probably do five more lists about the subject and just to get to all the different and maybe not even get that deep into it, right? Because there's so many different perspectives and so many different
Sure,
experiences in the
sure.
world. But yeah, that's kind of how I tackle each of the lists, wanting to figure out how broad we could talk about it in global circumstances and from different perspectives.
And I dig it a lot. And another question for you. So, and one I'm really curious about, and in fact, you could probably do a list of just this. But so, if you did a list of your favorite genres of film, like a top 10 genres of film for you personally, would political movie genre fall onto that list? Because I know political films ain't everybody's bag.
Yeah, I would say that political films definitely rank very high for me. They haven't always until later in my life, in the last maybe decade or so. But political films can also be very dry, depending on the subject matter and who's making them and stuff. So, to me, what I really love is the genre movie political message mashup. Like I was talking about with Sam Fuller and his genre filmmaker that he was, but also political messages in his films. That to me is very important. Where we have the dressings of a genre, sort of beginning and ending of a movie that you're like going into, and you think it's going to be a western or it's going to be a crime film, and then in the core of the movie, when you really get to the middle of the movie, it's talking about some sort of political message inside that. So it's this subversion of things, and so that mashup is actually ranks among my favorite types of movies.
Excellent, excellent stuff. And really, now I am starting to think maybe we should do a top 10 movie genre list and see where
Mm.
that falls out. Although I kind of have a feeling horror would be your number one or genre in particular.
Yeah,
But we'll
maybe.
save that for another day. All right, a
Mhm.
final question for you, good sir. The one we always come back to on any list we do here on the Fub Poli Sci. Why or does this list even matter? And really, what I mean to say is, what would you tell people who haven't experienced films like this before, this genre?
Yeah, I would say if you haven't experienced political films, ask yourself, are you interested in these things? And if you are, what are you missing in the movies that you consume about the subjects that you're concerned about? But also, a lot of these films definitely talk about the history of the political situations and the places that they're from. And as always, you can educate yourself through entertainment. So a lot of these films that I have on here are dealing with things, but they're also whether they're thrillers or comedies or satires or whatever, are also thrillingly entertaining. So if you watch any of these films, I think you're going to be entertained. You're going to have I won't say a good time, but you'll have an experience that's unlike most regular, run of the mill movies out there. But why this list is important is a good question, because to me, I love each of these films for what they are individually, but just like I said earlier, um, the mix of the arts and the craft of filmmaking with political messages, I think, is a great way for cinema to be used by artists. But each of them individually is very dear to me, and it really shows off how much these people care about these issues in their countries, and aren't necessarily making movies, cheap movies that are going to be forgotten in a few years, or immediately upon release. So yeah, so these are films that I think they really like grab you and make you pay attention and make you aware of what's going on in different parts of the world.
I like that response about what's going on in all over the world, but also like raising awareness of yourself, viewing things through a different medium. But I also kind of am automatically called back to a previous conversation we had about the importance of watching films from all over the world. Because, and you had even said that for many people, we're not going to get to travel all 200 countries in the world, right? It's just not enough time, too much money. But film from different countries, be it Bollywood from India or movies from Iran, it gives you an idea about how we as human beings are different all around the world. And it's really incredible to be able to learn about culture and human beings. But
Yeah.
I think this list and what you have done for us here with a lot of these international films that talk about politics, you also demonstrated how we are everyone, all over the world, asking the same questions
Yeah.
about how do we deal. Oh, I'm sorry, go.
No, no, no. I was going to say yes. I would definitely to the heart of that. Where we are different, and you can see these films, and there are different cultural uh, barriers or whatever, or difficult cultural barriers. But yeah, if you watch these films, yeah, you could definitely see how similar we are.
Yeah, and I think that's a beautiful thing for people to realize that while we have diversity as, people, we are still from day to day asking ourselves so many of the exact same questions. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, especially whenever you think about the film you mentioned about the two sisters of two different ideologies. How do they reconcile that? Whenever you talk about the films that are dealing with race, how do you reconcile racism today versus racism 40 years ago? These are questions that aren't specifically just American questions. These are global questions about human beings. And I think that's
Hmm.
one
Hmm.
great reason why you should watch these movies to help us understand that we as human beings, we think a lot of the same thoughts. All right, my friend, let me say thank you so much for coming on today and for doing a political list with us. And real quick, before I let you go, why don't you tell us what's been going on with Hipsville AD lately and where Lo-Fi listeners can find you?
Yeah, man. Over at Hipsville, coincidentally, I just did a top 10 list on my blog about Samuel Fuller, the director I talked about who directed White Dog. I don't talk about White Dog in that post, but it is a look at his political subversive films from the 50s and 60s. So if you're interested in American cinema and political filmmaking and genre filmmaking, I highly recommend you go check out that thing I just posted there. You can find it at badday.substack.com, or if you go to my Instagram, Hipsville AD, that's my handle there. You can hit the link in my bio and you can get right over to that. Yeah, so I highly recommend that if you want to check that stuff out, if you want to get a little deeper into the films of that filmmaker um, and kind of learn more about American cinema. I had a blast writing that. He's one of my favorite filmmakers. But yeah, if you in any event, if you want to hit me up just to talk movies or ask me for recommendations or whatever, you can find me at hipsvillead@gmail.com.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you so much again, Gregory Day, and we look forward to having you come back again soon. And can't wait to see what list you cook up for us next time. And that's it. That's Tuesday's top 10 list. And do you have your own top 10 list ideas out there? Go ahead and send them on in. And do you have good news to share? Come on, share that goodness. We all need it. Always remember that Lofi Poli Sci is more than just me. It's the we that we be. Peace and well-being to all my human beings. Much love and always the best. Pickering and Day, signing off.